Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome Alan Moran. Welcome, Alan.
Hi, Ali.
No
Good stuff.
worries. How's the weather in Melbourne?
Pretty good now. It's been pretty rough for the last couple of days, though. I've been
Mm,
in Melbourne and Canberra. I've been dodging
okay.
thunderstorms all the way through there and back.
Okay, righto. And how did it go in Canberra for you?
Oh, it's quite pleasant there. It's not a bad little sleepy town, Canberra. It's
I've got,
bad from the rest of Australia, but it's actually not a bad place.
no worries. I've got my brother lives in Canberra, so yeah, no worries. Okay, so today's subject again, Murray-Darling Basin Plan, but I think the big ticket for me is actually the closing down of Holden's. I'm just
Mm.
going to cut across the closing down of the Holden showrooms. Let's be clear about it. So that was in the ABC today, and I think that's to me it's an important article because to me it's the end of a long line. The long line being the deconstruction of Australian industry. Um, and I'm going to actually allude to documents, but I'll place the links after it. But essentially, the Lima Declaration was signed in 1975 by Australian representatives, and it was continued to be endorsed and actually pursued as a policy by both sides of Parliament, both flavours of government. And so since that time, we've actually seen five car industries go: our steel industry, our shipyards, white goods, all these sorts of things. And where Australia is now is it's essentially an open pit for export, but not necessarily for, if you like, our own security, our own reliability. And so it's actually been an undoing of us as a, if you like, our sovereignty. In my view, our sovereignty. We're no longer independent. We're no longer self-reliant. We've actually been, if you like, thrown to the wolves. In my view, the recent acknowledgement of the Canadian government's purchase of significant quota of the Murray-Darling Basin water allocation. It's interesting that I see it essentially superannuation fund managed by the government. I think that's how I read it. But of course, you've got to consider that behind any government enterprise are actual banks in order for the government to actually pursue something. And so that says that banks are actually dominating, in my view, in my point of view, are dominating what's actually going on with the Murray-Darling Basin and certainly water allocation. Alan, your thoughts?
Well, I think this, I agree with you. There's an awful lot of deconstruction or destruction of Australian industry going on, and the Holden thing uh, is just the final pimple that's been cut off of
Hmm.
this carbuncle. Um, Basically, in that case, though, as in many other cases of industry deconstruction, it's been due to the way we've allowed industries to be run. In the case of the car industry, it was on life support from the go-get. It was basically dependent on government subsidies and preventing other people from importing into Australia. And that got worse and worse. And it got worse and worse because essentially the car industry wasn't run by Holden's, it wasn't run by Toyota, it wasn't run by Ford, it was run by the unions. And the unions demanded certain work practices which were expensive and non-productive. Car industry could not compete, could not provide the cars that you and I want to buy at the price we would buy compared to if we actually bought them straight from Japan or Thailand or wherever else. So the industry closed down in that respect. It was industries change and they move in terms of their competitiveness from country to country. But in Australia's case, because we enshrined union domination into those heavy manufacturing industries like that, we actually then forced them to become, or they allowed them to become far less efficient. I'll give you an example the other way.
Hmm.
I've been involved, as you may know, in the electricity industry
Hmm.
in Australia for a long time. When I was first involved in the electricity industry, in Victoria, there were, from memory, about 20,000 people involved in producing electricity, in generating electricity in the various facilities there.
Hmm.
Once they were privatized and sold off, there were only like 3,000 or 4,000 people involved. In other
Hmm.
words, a massive reduction in the number of workers there.
Hmm.
Now, in one sense, you say, well, that means fewer workers, fewer jobs. But what it actually meant was much cheaper electricity. And much cheaper electricity meant more money or more discretionary income for you and I who buy electricity. It meant cheaper input for people who are producing goods and services which use electricity, which is just about everything. So where something was freed from the shackles of a government type or a union type monopoly into something where the managers operated it and did so rationally at lowest cost, then we became very competitive. And for a time, until we wrecked the electricity industry, but with renewable subsidies and other things from about the last 15 years, for a time we were just about the cheapest and most efficient electricity producer in the world.
Mm. I think that there is and I accept your point, Alan, as a valid point, that when it was run by, if you like, governments, the electricity as such did become cheaper. But I will acknowledge that, in my view, electricity or was built to a standard, in the sense that the infrastructure was built to a standard, and it's an engineering standard, not necessarily a commercial standard, and that is different because, of course, your engineering standard may require a higher standard of componentry and all that sort of thing in it in order to secure the supply. We haven't, in my view, we don't have reliable electricity. In fact, in my view, electricity is quite precarious and it's certainly expensive. So we've actually had a running down of this industry going on for a long time. Um, it's frustrating because if you only look at the wages or the salaried people gone from 20,000 down to 3,000, I experienced exactly the same type of phenomena that where we would have had 20 people in the oil and gas industry over the 35 years. Yes, we did go down to three or something similar to that number to achieve the same production throughput. So it was always there. But the industry itself, because it is it is volatile, it is dangerous, it is hazardous, it has to be built to an engineering standard. And my experience is when it was not adhered to, when they actually didn't even adhere to their own modes of practice, then there was always a penalty to pay, and it showed up soon enough. And to me, that's it's vitally important that utilities are built to a standard. I mean, you wouldn't do it the same with pipes or anything like that to do with water. You'd be springing holes everywhere. So you do have to achieve a standard. So to me, this is appreciate it. I recognise the 3,000, but again, with the 3,000, that also means that in Australia, that workforce that was once there of 20,000, where you had 20,000 incomes,
Mm.
and that income base was spread across 20,000 families. It was now changed to spread across 3,000 families. And so that means to me is a winding down of spending power within the community. It's a winding down of the standard of living. But again, you may have other thoughts, Alan.
Certainly do. I think it's not a winding down in that sense. It's basically making, in that case, the thing cheaper. And if it's cheaper, then people have got more money to spend on other things. Now I know, okay, in that case, the power industry dropped from 20,000 to 3,000 or 4,000 workers, but overall there was other jobs created. The level of unemployment and employment in Australia hasn't gone down. It's still the same. In fact, the unemployment rate right now is quite low by historical standards, about 3 or 4%. Uh, Basically, the jobs are there. Other jobs are created because of the economies that are made in terms of cheaper product, cheaper output for things.
Mm,
Uh, you know, it's essentially it's not just a pie of jobs, and when you knock those jobs off, then there's nothing else comes about to replace them. Lots of jobs replace them.
mm.
Uh,
I see a lot of. I was talking with a bloke on the phone yesterday, and we talked about the tourism industry. And to me, if Australia concentrates on, say, the tourism industry, or it concentrates on education, all right, and the university industry, I call it an industry,
mhm.
and as forms of income, I think to me these are not solid. Um, it's not a solid industry that secures the self-reliance of a nation. To me, it's not a nation-making industry. Car manufacturing, white goods, steel, aluminium, shipbuilding, the Snowy Mountain, power generation, water, infrastructure. I mean, these to me are nation-building industries, and we're actually running all of these industries down. to a point where they're really precarious. The industry itself, physically, I mean, our electrical, you can't. No one could disagree. We're in a precarious position. The last few weeks in South Australia, South Australia, as I understand it, was isolated from the national grid, and we're in a very precarious position for a couple of weeks. Our water situation, if it wasn't for this recent um, array of showers that have come across to put the fires out, we're in dire straits because of the drought. And we're again precarious for food production, for irrigation, for industry, things like that. These these to me, there's no future proofing any of it in Australia. It really is precarious, and it comes back, in my view, to the signing of the Lima Declaration, where governments of all persuasions agreed that they were going to hand over our integral industry, our nation securing, our nation building industry, handed over to third world nations. Your thoughts, Alan?
Well, I don't think the Lima Declaration is that influential on it. I certainly would agree with you that the precarious situation for electricity, especially in South Australia, is being highlighted right now. But that situation is caused by government action, which governments have subsidised wind and solar, which is highly irregular and not reliable.
Hmm.
Uh, in fact, one the Premier actually blew up the
Yeah.
last remaining coal generator.
Mm.
So when South Australia gets isolated, it's got the wrong kind of electricity, and the prices shoot through the roof. And South Australia has seen a whole state blackout more once, and it's been pretty damn close a couple of other times. I mean, this is government policy which has destroyed the viability of the electricity industry in the state, forced people to stop operating. As far as water is concerned, yeah, um, Australia's got a massive, a more variable rainfall than anywhere else in the world.
Mm.
And the early settlers recognised that. Anyone with the cities there, they put high dams in because they knew they had to have storage for years of water storage. In England, where it rains every damn day, nearly, they've got storage for like 4 weeks. You don't need any more.
Yeah.
Four 4 weeks, we'd have starved. We'd have been had our throats dry 30 times in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
Um, in Australia. So yeah, so we have a problem in Australia. Yeah, we have a problem because we misallocate the water. The Labor and Turnbull conspired back about 12 years ago to take about 20% of the water from the irrigators and flush it down the river to water the trees or whatever else they thought was worthy of it. Okay, that's reduced the productivity, reduced the input, the essential input to farming in the greatest the greatest farming out province we have in Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin, that
Yeah.
reduced by 20%. Well, what's
Yeah.
going to happen? Of course, you're actually going to reduce your output by a significant amount, maybe not 20%, but certainly a significant amount. Government bastardry in terms of the way they've operated the electricity and the water industry has created these issues. Now, you lay that back to the Lima 1975 declaration. I don't know that that's that influential, and I think it's just governments are so foolish and so have got such strong feelings about they know how to operate economies better, that they allow this sort of thing to take place, and we are much the poorer for it.
I'm going to ask a difficult question, Alan, and I'm okay if we stop the show if you don't want to answer it. Who are the government working for? Honestly, who do you think our government is working for? Because it's certainly not working for the Australian people.
No, I'll tell you who the government's working for. The government's working for the government. The government is working for the government.
Mm.
Basically, they want to stay in power, and they operate in ways which will keep them in power. So essentially, there's a lot of people that the people have fermented ideas, and we're talking about some of the green ideas that have been fermented at the present time. Get people say, "Oh, I want green power. I want this power and that power." The government's actually obliged and give it to them. Why do the people want that power? Because they've been propagated. There's agitprop promoting it. In fact, only today, Jeff Bezos, who essentially owns Amazon,
Mm.
has announced he's given $10 billion US to promote agitational propaganda on renewable energy and non-carbon energy. I mean, this is a colossal amount, and can buy a lot of people's minds. And buying the minds, they'll vote for people, for politicians, or all most politicians will have to respond.
I see. I appreciate where you're coming from, and I acknowledge or recognise the inordinate influence that environmentalism has over our government, especially our, believe it or not, our Conservative government. But the thing is that the Conservative government has also got the hand on the till. They actually finance most of our universities, and from the universities comes most of this, if you like, environmental thinking. They actually finance it, and then they make out or complain that they're being forced into a corner to actually implement it. I come back and I ask the question again, honestly, who is our government working for? Because they could stop this whole environmental thing in a heartbeat. They could stop the ABC of it brainwashing us constantly, force feeding us on this environmental agenda, and yet they don't do anything about it.
And
Who are they working for?
I pray every day that they will, just as you do.
Yeah,
I pray every day. Why don't they? You know, they can't. Basically, a very good friend of mine who was until recently the leader of the opposition, later became leader of the opposition in Western Australia. He was the senior advisor to a premier at the time, and he decided, why are we giving all this money in arts grants? Basically, they put on plays, they do things which vilify conservative governments.
yeah,
We don't give money in arts grants. He cut them off. He cut them off. Well, what happens? The media are up in arms. These are people who are very articulate, people who have received these grants. The media are up in arms about, we're destroying civilizations. We know it. You've got to do this. And the government starts tanking in the opinion polls. The premier of the day said, "Listen, Mike, we can't do this. I can't live with it. We're going to be out of office soon." It's kind of it's a set of machinery. Theoretically, the government could cut them off. An example at the present time, a topical example in the UK, same issue they had there. BBC, it financed there, totally against against the government there. Now the government there has finally said, okay, we're going to cut off their funding, but it's facing tremendous opposition in doing so, and they have an easier way of cutting off their funding than we do in Australia. They just say, well, we're going to cut off they have a license there. We're going to make that license non-mandatory.
yeah.
Okay. The government there has just won a colossal victory in the polls. It's got a lot more influence than the Morrison government's got here. It is taking steps to do things to rectify a situation, but even that, they regard themselves as being courageous in doing that. If the Morrison government did it, he would have all the media totally against it, and basically the weight of that public opinion would crush it.
Okay.
They would. Now I'll tell you that 90% of the politicians in the Morrison government would take out the ABC tomorrow. Yes, why wouldn't they? The ABC it just agitates, propagates against them. They can't do so because if they do it, then they'll face far greater opposition on the airwaves and in the printed media.
To me, that's an acknowledgement of who our government works for, Alan. Thank you so much. Our government is actually working for the real power, and the power is exercised through our media, and it dominates our government, and our governments respond to the media. They don't respond to the people, they respond to the media. And I think that it's a vital, vital point. We don't control our government. We don't have a say in it. We vote in basically an elected dictatorship, and then they do whatever they're told through the media. So people like, if you like, the Soros or the Amazon bloke or Murdoch or whatever, used to be Packer, they have inordinate influence over our government. And I find that that's fascinating that you've actually shown that to us, and I think it's so important.
It takes a really strong-willed politician to buck it and to say, listen, or to have a very good message. I mean, we have them occasionally. We have them in Reagan. We've got them in Trump today. Thatcher, various people like that who said, no, I can cut through their message. I can stop them dominating me. But you know, there's like, you know, three people per century or something that are able to do that.
Hmm.
Otherwise, the government just goes along, floats along in the sea of general ideology generated and perpetuated by media people. When you say it's the media, it is the media, but it's the people in the end. The media influences the people who then dictate the government.
Okay, you all right? Because I'm sort of trying to visualize what you just said then, because to me the government is actually it's 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 setting up the infrastructure through our universities to teach our future teachers, our future industrial leaders. I know that it was that Cecil Rhodes was responsible for, I think it was the establishment, along with a banker, a central banker for the London School of Economics. And that to me is very important. The Harvard Business School, I think it's got just as big a colourful history of where big money has come in behind it. And I think the other day you mentioned about it may have been you or someone else who mentioned about the influence over the actual chemical industries, the influence that Rockefeller's had over that whole thing. I think that's fascinating because what it's showing, in my view, what it's showing is that the real seat of power is so much money it's not funny, and then it exercises it through our learning institutions. And this to me probably explains a lot as to why our seminaries, why we hear nothing. There's no moral, ethical anchor in this whole thing. It's just really I'll use the word laissez-faire, meaning really no bridle, no holding back on anything. It's just fair game for exploitation, and to me it's a very important consideration in this whole picture. Alan, your thoughts?
Well, I think the capture of those institutions by the left, the Green left, has been total in the last 30 or 40 years.
Hmm.
Uh, the universes are just, they used to talk about freedom of speech. They now talk about freedom of speech only for one side, and that they'll exclude anyone from the other side from
That's right.
having access to the
Yeah,
campus.
yeah,
And it's actually been a phenomena which we've seen throughout the Western world. In Australia, all the vice chancellors virtually, basically Labour Party apparatchiks who've been promoted there, and it percolates all the way through down there to the basic lecturers. And if you want to actually take a line which is somewhat dissimilar from the rest, then your career is very seriously jeopardized within the
yeah,
institute as such.
yeah,
Uh, I mean, I'd hate to think in terms of what if a youngster was offering an essay on scarcity of water, and didn't mention the fact that basically it's scarce because of global warming and therefore it's cold and whatever else. What kind of marks they would get? I wouldn't think they would get very much. So essentially, the institutions of learning, that is at the social area. It's different when you're talking about engineering and medicine and things like that. But in those social science areas, then the universities have been captured by the hard left, hard green left, and and that has an immense influence on all politics. You basically find that young people will say, "Look, I believe in climate change." What does that mean? What
yeah.
does it mean? I
It
mean, I
does.
believe in God. I believe in this. How can you believe in climate change? What does it mean? And you say, what does it mean? You're talking about you think the climate's going to get hotter. If so, why? And I mean, they don't really have opinions like that. They have a belief.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's I think that's very important in that it is a belief system. They've been influenced on something, and it's actually it's an explanation, if you like, of the way things are, and that
Mm.
explanation they fit it into the narrative. It's it was a Bacon. Bacon said the scientific method, and that is place his thesis there and challenge it and poke and probe it and substantiate it. And if it failed on one point, then it failed the scientific method.
Oh,
Whereas
yeah.
what's actually going on is a belief system, and it doesn't matter what's demonstrated, it's still belief. It's essentially like a religious
Point
zeal.
was wrong.
Yeah,
Now, if he fails on one point, then the test is wrong. It's just
yeah, I know. It's
it undermine the whole logic and the whole
yeah,
basis of society in the end. But in the interim, it certainly has this influence in terms of public opinion and the malleability of public opinion, and really says, I guess, something about about democracy and how democracy operates today, and whether it can operate in the way we think it can. I mean, in a lot of ways, the American revolutionaries understood this better than we do today. I mean, they kind of were in favor of democracy, but they're really in favor of liberty.
yeah.
It's all government, not.
There was and there is and even those we need to understand the ramifications of it as to whether it is, um, I use the word and it's not derogatory, like unbridled freedom, unbridled liberty in a sense. Because to me, freedom without a moral anchor, without an ethical anchor, you can actually, I mean, like that, you could have slavery and say, well, yes, we're free, and that other person is free to be my slave, but hang on, there's no ethics in that. This person has a soul just as you do, and they have a right to be free and to secure sustenance from the world around them, as anyone else. And
You're
it's
exactly right, and I think one. I
yeah,
mean, you've somewhat denigrated, I think, Adam Smith by talking about laissez-faire in ways it isn't quite the way he said, but he was very much in favor of moral foundations
yeah,
of laissez-faire.
yeah,
You've got to have that anchor of
yeah.
moral foundations, otherwise laissez-faire won't work.
Yeah, yeah, and that to me is the question before us. Really, is the moral anchor in what's going on, because we see our jobs are disappearing. That means that our, if you like, our income base for the average family, instead of being a tradesman working for an industry, they might be a waiter, or they might be supporting something that's just really, it's not a nation building industry anymore, and we're losing all of that. And so to me, the moral or ethics behind it is that we actually need to consider what's best for Australia on these things. And I don't think it's part of the equation. And I don't think it's part of the, if you like, the profit at all cost equation or the environment at all cost equation. I think it's part of holding those 2 points of view in tension and saying, well, we need to actually think of what's best for Australia. Yeah, your thoughts, Alan?
Well, I'm always a bit cautious about people saying what's best for Australia. I mean, we've had the Lenins and the Maos of this world, and the Fidel Castros who've said what's best for their countries and usually got it wrong.
Hmm.
I mean, it seems to me you basically got to say what's best for the nation in terms of allowing people the freedom to choose and to work where they want. That you mentioned some industries which have been have fallen apart, and partly is because of the way we operate them. We've allowed them to be operated, the white goods and shipbuilding and steel, etc. But there's no point in having a steel industry that produces steel at 100 times the cost that we can buy it overseas. I think everybody would agree with that, wouldn't they?
I personally don't, Alan. I don't on this basis, and I think this is the difference. We had the coal north of Adelaide. We had heaps of it at Lee Creek for power generation. We have the iron ore at Iron Knob. We also have the port, a reasonably deep water port, deep enough anyway, at Whyalla. And we had a perfect shipbuilding, steel industry, and power generation there. It was all there local. And from there, it was actually our, if you like, our apprentice hub for all of Australia, was those industries, iron ore, shipbuilding, and steel, and power generation. It was all there. It was a good, secure base, and those apprentices would actually filter right out to Australia. So to me, it was what was best for Australia was also actually what was best for the individuals in Australia, because they had jobs, they had a secure base, we had secure power generation, secure incomes, and then of course South Australia flourished, and the other nations of course harnessed the benefit from it, in that they had experienced and qualified tradespeople. They didn't have to go overseas looking for it. So to me, there's what's best for Australia or what's best for the individuals one at a time in Australia should be the same thing. Alan.
Well, let me put it this way: supposing that rather harmonious situation you described uh, produced goods which cost 100 times the goods you could buy from overseas, would it still be good? If it was 1,000 times. In other words, if we reduced our standard of living to 1% of its present level, would that still be good? If we could buy the same goods and services overseas and keep full employment, and bear in mind, even though you say that there's been those jobs have been lost, we have full employment in Australia now. Unemployment rate's 3 or 4%. Uh, Jobs have grown. You know, it's very attractive to suggest what you suggested, that industry, that structure. We had the coal, we had the iron ore, we had the other things. It should have been made to work. It didn't, because it didn't was unable to work for a number of reasons. Some of it was union obstruction, some of it was poor government, some of it was excessive taxation, some of it was requirements on this, that, and the other. One way or the other, those industries weren't able to be viable or competitive in a global situation. You may not think that's all that important, and it may not be that important, but the corollary of it is, if in fact that they were producing those goods at several times the cost of elsewhere, then that means that the standard of living of the people working there were, what a small fraction of what they might have been,
Mm.
and we can't have that.
Okay. I think that if I've read is it Trans-Pacific Partnership, the recent trade agreement signed by Australia, and as I understand it, everything that the government buys, it has to actually put out to tender, and whoever achieves the least expensive tender actually achieves it. In Australia, we used to have a truck manufacturing called International Trucks, I think it was International Trucks, and the government would buy them and use them. And what it did was it provided jobs, it also provided us security. And then, under a trade agreement, another company from overseas came in and offered the trucks at a cheaper price. And so Australian industry was shut down. What they've neglected to take into account was, as soon as the trucks arrived, the spare parts for the trucks were so expensive that the parent company was making a killing on them. We lost an industry, and it ended up becoming more expensive, and we shot ourselves in the foot. And I think that, to me, is the corollary of why do we need to have our jobs here. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a horrendous agreement. I certainly don't agree with it. I don't endorse it. I don't know why our Conservative governments signed away things like that. It's, to me, it's a long list of treachery. Now, in regard to the Lima Declaration, 1975, North-South dialogue. This is Malcolm Fraser's era, North-South dialogue. Malcolm Fraser was the one who was advocating it. Conservative Prime Minister. He was also responsible for shutting down Whyalla, the shipyards. He shut it down basically as a stroke of a pen. And there it was, that whole Iron Triangle was emasculated by a Conservative Prime Minister for no serious advantage to the nation. If anything, it was our undoing. I think these things we can actually go through and look at them time and time again, and I think that's really why archival records are so important in investigating, going in, who did what to who, when, where, and how. Um, I'm going to put some links up for our viewers so they can have a look at it and see the Barry Jones from the Labor government, the Evans, the Keatings, the Howards, the Peacocks, the Malcolm Frasers. I think it was Senator Button, I think, but I'm not sure. But there was certainly a very important figure who actually signed that Lima Declaration. And I think it's very important to look at that and recognise that the deconstruction of our industry is long-standing, and it's been going on a long time, and we are seriously hurting. We are seriously hurting. Alan, it's been a beaut forum. I know it's none of these are easy things, because it's, to me, this is rubber at the road. We are right there looking at the ramifications of things. You can have as long as you like. Your closing thoughts, please.
Well, yeah, I don't attach a great deal of importance to the Lima Declaration. I do attach a great deal of importance to various actions that governments have done, which you maintain is consistent with the signature of that declaration. I think that we do live in a world we live in an open world. You talked a little about security. Australia hasn't got any security. Are you kidding? We basically have been dependent on foreign powers, England and America, but virtually from federation anyway, for our security. And whether or not we have these industries, these clusters of industries in Australia, is almost irrelevant to the security of the nation. Um, but there's nothing wrong with having these industries. It's great to have them, but we can only have them if they are viable, if they are low cost. If we have them in the high cost, then we destroy our standard of living. And if we destroy our standard of living, then we do destroy our capacity in the end to defend ourselves as a nation. It's very important that we get these things right. And the fact that we don't have a car industry now is partly due to union measures and government measures as well. The fact that we don't have white goods industries now is also possibly due to that. Although some of these products have become simpler. Building a fridge was kind of like a complex issue. Now it's not complex. It's putting together a whole series of components, uh, sending them through an assembly line, and either selling them domestically or not. There's not really a great deal of high tech in it. The end product is that we become wealthy by specializing, by working smarter, by ensuring we save money, by save and investment. And if we're doing these things, we will be wealthy. If we actually siphon off some of that expenditure, some of that work, and some of that investment into areas which are unproductive, we are poorer for it, and we've got to be very careful when we decide to do that sort of thing and override the basic economics of doing things smarter and in ways that enrich our souls.
No worries. Alan Moran, thank you so much for today. It's been a beaut forum. Thank
Great.
you. No
Okay.
worries. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Cheers.